In this last section, we're going to walk through distribution of our project. So we've walked through all of the bits of creating our project. Now we're going to actually do a distribution of the sample project that's already installed with your sample files for the hackathon. It's easier to go ahead and distribute this because it has all of the pieces necessary, all of the scripts necessary, and this is what you would be using to examine for game design, components, and so forth. So we're going to go and do a distribution of this project, and at the end of that, you'll be ready to go and start on your hackathon. Good luck, and let's get started. Alright, so now that we have everything ready, we're going to go ahead and build a distribution. Now for this distribution, we're not going to use the scenes that we've been constructing. We're going to use two scenes that are ready to go, that are kind of wired together already, so that we can go ahead and do a distribution and start it and see it working. This has a lot of the sample code that you guys will be able to use. You'll be able to just deconstruct the stuff in the hackathon scenes and use them for your own purposes. But we're finally here, so let's go ahead and do our distribution, see what that looks like, see what's involved, so that we can go ahead and conclude and move on to showing you guys what a regular game would look like, how it's architected, what it's put together with, and so forth in that sample code, so that you have a better feel for what you should be doing and how you should be structured. So, I've opened up the main menu scene under the hackathon. And in the main menu scene, we have a canvas. We've talked about canvases already, and it's set up basically the same way that we were talking about before. It has two basic menus, one for play, one for quit. And basically, as you click on play, we want it to load the first level of our game, and then we move on and work our way through that level. In order to make this work, we need to go ahead and set up our distribution so that the scenes are all bundled together and the application is set up to run. So let's go into the Unity build settings. So under File, go to Build Settings. And this is where you would put together your build. Now, one of the things that you should see here at the top are the scenes that are in your build. So currently there's nothing in the build. If we were to try and run this game, nothing would happen. There's no asset for Unity to actually start. In the platform, here's a list of the platforms that this version of Unity knows about, whether they're installed or not. There may be other platforms that you don't have access to here, that if you install their plugins, they will show up in this list. But the basic ones are here. So we have our PC, Mac, Linux standalone. If you have the target platform ready to be compiled, you're good to go. As we saw earlier, I have Android installed for this platform, so I can do an Android release. I did not install the Universal Windows platform, so I couldn't build a Universal Windows app. I can build one for Windows, but not a universal one. Same thing for tvOS, PS4, iOS, Xbox One, WebGL, and there's some other ones here for VR and so forth that I just don't have installed here. So going back to the PC version, which we're going to build here, if you're on the Mac, it's going to be pretty much the same. Under this, you're going to have your target platform. I have Windows here because I'm on Windows and I have that one installed. If I had installed the Mac and I had the ability to build the Mac on this machine, it would show up in here. Architecture that I'm building for, etc., etc., etc. Typically, the only thing that you're going to change in here is if you want to do a development build, where you can run your game and perform some script debugging and so forth. But typically with your games at this stage, you would be doing a lot of interactive debugging as you're putting your game together. So you don't necessarily need to do a development build. Development builds tend to be slower. So unless you really want to incur that to do remote debugging and so forth, which you absolutely don't need to do at this stage, just go ahead and run a regular build. But the first thing we need to do is let Unity know what stuff we want in our build. So in order to do that, we need to move the scenes from Unity that we want in our game into the build. So we can move our sample scene into the build, and we can move our main menu into the build, and these kind of make up the game, the sample game that we have that you can play around with and use. Now, these numbers to the right matter. So the one with the lowest index, in this case 0, is the one that's going to get loaded first. So we want the main menu obviously to be loaded first, so we would drag the main menu scene so that it is the first scene, scene 0. So when the player starts, the main menu is going to be the scene that first comes up, and then any scenes that come after that can come in whatever order they want. You may want them in a particular order for some reason, but it doesn't really matter from Unity's perspective. Really, you just need to make sure that the first scene that you load is the main menu scene. Now, if you were working on some scenes and you wanted to have those added to this as well, that's what this Add Open Scenes button is for. That's how you would add that. The next thing you're going to want to do is take a look at player settings. In the player, this is how you would set up what the product name is and the company name and so forth that Unity is going to be using internally to represent your game. And so if you're publishing to an asset store or anything along those lines, these settings matter. They don't matter so much for your hackathon, but it's just a good practice to go ahead and set them up. So we can set our company name to Greg's Company and set the product name to, we called it Product Foo, we can leave it called Product Foo version 0.1. Now the default icon that you set is any texture 2D that you have created in your application or imported into your application that you want to use to represent the icon on the desktop, both on the Windows, macOS desktop, or on the Android or iOS device when this app is installed. Now remember, I said the texture and not the sprite, because it's not going to use sprites for these. You need to use a texture. So if you brought an image in that you wanted to use for the default icon and you converted it over to a sprite, you just need to go back and convert that back over into a texture, set it to default, and it'll be just fine. So we'll just select here. We have a lot of different things that we can choose from, and we will just grab something at random. This gold one looks pretty cool. So we'll go ahead and pull that in. And it's a gold dollar button, and that's what the icon would be. Next is the default cursor. If you're trying to change your cursor, this is where you would do it. Depends on your application. Now for mobile devices and so forth, this isn't going to have any application to you because of course you typically don't have cursors there, so changing it won't mean anything. Now this is the cursor that will exist only in your game. When the mouse moves into your game, it will change to that cursor. When it moves outside of your game, it'll change to the other one. If you want to change it, you're welcome to do so. That's typically not done for a lot of applications unless you have some specific user interface reasons for doing so. Other things that are in here, you can take a look at any audio settings, graphic settings. So we're just using the standard render pipeline. If there were some other render pipelines, so like if you're creating high quality graphics, there is a high fidelity render pipeline that you would use here. We're using the universal render pipeline, and that's what everything would be set up for. You would be able to set up certain things for the different tiers of graphics, things that you want to turn on, things that you want to turn off. Input Manager, we haven't used anything specifically for the Input Manager here, but if we did, they would show up here and we'd be able to use that. The physics stuff, if there were some different things that we wanted to set for physics, we would make sure that they were set here. Negative 9.81 is basically what the default is for gravity to mimic what it is on Earth. You would do something similar for physics 2D. If you had 2D physics going, the player is what we were configuring here as well. The quality, so if there were different quality settings that you wanted to offer and not offer, you would set that up in here. Typically you're not going to mess around with that too much. Script execution order. This is if you had lots of scripts and some scripts needed to execute before others did. At runtime, this is where you would set that. So in this particular case, you have the Unity event system is absolutely running before any other scripts that are here. So you could change that if you wanted to, but have a good reason to do so. Typically, you want to leave this stuff alone. The order that they install is just the order that they should be in. Tags and layers. So we've talked about tagging and we've talked about layers. If you had to add some additional layers, they would show up in here. You would make sure that they were set. And these aren't the project settings for the build. These are the project settings just for the project in general. So you're just going through here and reviewing to make sure that there's nothing funky that you forgot or didn't change or whatever before you do your build. TextMesh Pro is all set up and installed. Now time settings. If you were trying to make your game run faster or slower, this is how you would change the time step. And the maximum amount of time allowed for a time step before the frame basically gets cut or skipped, etc. So none of this really needs to change for any of your projects, but it's just a good idea to review it just to have an idea of what it is before you get going. Now, with that said, you are actually ready to do a build. So you would just click on build, or you could click on build and run. Build and run simply means do a build, and when you finish, go ahead and run it. Unity Cloud Build is something that you would be doing for larger projects. If you wanted to do a build and you knew it was going to take a long amount of time, you could submit your whole build process up to the cloud, and it would run on some servers and get built there, and it would have a place for you to download your executable. If you're a Windows person and you're trying to do a Mac build or an iOS build, things that you don't typically have the ability to build from Windows, that is your mechanism for being able to do that. But for the hackathon, for small projects, you're pretty much just going to be running on the platform that you have available. So you can go ahead and click on build and run. You're going to select a folder where you want your application to be built to. And it doesn't matter what you call it. I call it the distro folder. You can call it whatever, my application. Doesn't really matter. I'll select that folder. And then at that point, Unity is going to go through and do some dependency management. It's going to start optimizing some things, putting the resources together, compiling the shaders that are used in the project, and then basically put the player together. And then it's going to run, which it's doing now. So here I am in my very simple game, which has a play menu and a quit menu. I will go to the play menu and click on play, and when I do that, I am in the game that we were looking at earlier, the scene that we were looking at earlier. And that's pretty much it. Once you get to this point of running and building your game, you will have a distributable file that you can now give to someone else to run your game. So at this point, this is where you start playtesting, finding bugs, fixing things, getting your game ready for distribution and delivery to the people who are going to play it and judge it. And that is pretty much it in a nutshell. That's kind of the end of the basic 6 lessons that we have for this course. Everything else that's coming after this is going to be a bonus on game structure, layout, design, where we will put together this scene that you're looking at here, have a player that can walk around in it and so forth. But for all practical purposes, we are done with everything that you need to know in order to put a game together in Unity, running through it all in maybe about 3 or 4 hours and building your game in a couple of days so that you can compete in a hackathon and do some cool stuff and experiment and get people to recognize your coolness and greatness. So if there are any questions, you know how to reach me. But until then, thanks, and I'm going to sign off. Good luck. I wish you the best and have fun.
Everybody ask me how I know. I smiled at them and said she told me so. Everybody ask me how I know. I smiled at them and said she told me so. Everybody ask me how I know. I smiled at them and said she told me so.